He told her he was ruined the very first evening they met. Not in a whisper, not with shame, but with the calm, deliberate certainty of a man stating what might be a simple fact. The ballroom at Hartwell House was at its most merciless that night. Chandeliers blazing, silk gowns catching the candlelight, London society arranged in its usual architecture of performance and quiet cruelty, and James Wentworth, the 8th Earl of Fairbridge, stood at its gilded edge and informed Miss Rosalind Cavendish that the Wentworth estate was gone. Every last penny of it. 3 women had fled that same conversation earlier in the evening. He had watched them go with the detached patience of a man conducting an experiment he already knew the result of. Rosalind did not flee. She looked at him, not at his title, not at the magnificent cut of his coat, not at the signet ring he had apparently forgotten to remove in his newfound poverty, but at his face, with the quiet, unhurried attention of someone reading a document a second time. Then she said softly, "I am sorry, my lord. That must be a very lonely thing to carry into a room like this." James had not prepared for that answer. In 3 seasons of calculated social theatre, not a single woman had looked at his manufactured ruin and seen only the man beneath it. Something shifted in his chest, small and involuntary, like a door he believed permanently sealed moving on its hinge. What he could not possibly know, what no one beneath those blazing chandeliers knew, was that Rosalind Cavendish understood the precise weight of a smile worn above a secret. She had been wearing hers for 7 months. The expression she carried tonight was the most expensive thing she owned, and it was costing her more with every passing hour. James Wentworth had spent 3 seasons building an elaborate test to separate the fortune hunters from the sincere. He had just unknowingly placed his heart in the hands of a woman whose own ruin made his fiction look like a parlor game. He only understood he was in danger when she turned to leave. She paused once without looking back and said, "I hope you kept the library, my lord. Everything else can be rebuilt." James stood in the thinning ballroom long after Rosalind Cavendish had disappeared into the crowd, her words still suspended in the air where she had left them. He had delivered that fiction in 4 ballrooms and 6 drawing rooms across 3 seasons. He had watched women perform their sympathy, recalculate his value, and withdraw with the polished efficiency of merchants adjusting a ledger. Not one of them had said anything he remembered the following morning. This woman had said something he suspected he would still be turning over at the age of 80. He found his closest friend, Lord Edward Rowe, at the champagne table, watching James's expression with the quiet amusement of a man who had been waiting for precisely this. "She didn't run," Edward observed. "No," James said, "she did not," and James set down his untouched glass. "Find out everything you can about Miss Rosalind Cavendish." What Edward returned with 3 days later was not what James had expected. Rosalind Cavendish was the only daughter of the late Viscount Danforth, dead of a fever 18 months prior, leaving behind him a title that died with him. A London townhouse mortgaged to its foundations, and debts his daughter had been quietly and methodically absorbing ever since. She had sold her mother's jewels the previous November. Her last remaining lady's maid had not been paid since February. The Cavendish carriage had been sold in March and replaced with hired transport she used only when absolutely necessary. She had told no one, not in society at least. The grief and the financial ruin had arrived together, and Rosalind had apparently decided to carry both with the same composure she brought to everything else. James read the report twice. He thought about the smile she had worn in the ballroom, the one that was costing her more with every passing hour. He understood now precisely what it had cost. He also understood something that settled in his chest with uncomfortable weight. Rosalind Cavendish had not passed his test. She had rendered it entirely irrelevant. She had looked at a man she believed was ruined and offered him human kindness. Not because it was safe or strategically sound, but because she appeared constitutionally incapable of doing otherwise. He began to call. The drawing room at the Cavendish townhouse on Henrietta Street was exactly as Edward's report had described. Stripped of its ornamental silver, the side tables bare where candlesticks had once stood, The curtains slightly faded at their edges, as though the house were slowly and quietly withdrawing from itself. Rosalind received him in a day dress of deep blue wool, her dark hair pinned with no ornamentation whatsoever, and she showed no particular surprise at his arrival and no performance of pleasure. She offered him tea and a chair, and when he sat, she looked at him with the same gray-eyed attention as before, as though she had been reading him at a measured pace and had simply resumed the chapter where she left off. "You are not ruined," she said before he could speak. It was not a question. James looked at her steadily. "What makes you say so?" "The signet ring," she said. "Men surrendering their estates do not arrive at Hartwell House wearing their family crest. They arrive wearing whatever they can sell it for." She folded her hands in her lap. "Also, you carry yourself like a man, testing something rather than losing something. There is a considerable difference, my lord." He had the strange, disorienting sensation of being read like one of her books. "You said nothing at the ball. It was not my secret to expose. You are not angry." "I am curious," Rosalind said, "which is entirely different. A man of your position conducting that particular experiment has a reason for it. I find I would rather understand the reason than object to the method." He did not tell her the reason that first day. He was not yet ready, and she did not press him. She asked him instead about Fairbridge Hall, not the estate or the income, but the house itself, its age, its rooms, its character. He answered, and found the conversation easier than he had anticipated, and left after an hour with the peculiar lightness of a man who has spent too long holding his breath and has briefly been allowed to stop. He called again 2 days later, and 3 days after that. It was on the 4th visit, over tea that was always slightly weaker than it ought to be. He had noticed this early and said nothing, and he suspected she knew he had noticed and was quietly grateful for his silence, that the wall came down far enough. She asked, with her characteristic directness, whether he had always distrusted as a general principle, or whether something specific had taught him the habit. The question was not unkind, it was simply precise. So James told her. He told her about Lady Charlotte Hale. Intelligent, charming, and entirely in love with the Fairbridge estate rather than its owner. He told her about the evening he had proposed and the morning she had left for Lord Graves, who was richer by a margin that had apparently outweighed everything else. He told her about the particular quality of that humiliation, the way it had taught him to trust the architecture of his own judgment more than the evidence of his own heart. Rosalind listened to all of it without interrupting once. "You built a wall," she said when he finished, "and called it a test." "I built a test," he said. "You built a wall," she replied, gently but without apology, "and the test was what you placed on top of it so it looked more dignified." She met his eyes without flinching. "I am not criticizing. I have built 1 or 2 of my own." They met 8 more times over the following 3 weeks. In the drawing room on Henrietta Street, in the lending library on Bond Street, where she returned 3 volumes and selected 2 more with the focused economy of a woman who treated books as necessities rather than luxuries, and once in Hyde Park, where she walked at a pace, suggesting she had long since made walking her primary mode of transport, and had simply extended the habit to social occasions. James found himself anticipating these meetings with an urgency he recognized and distrusted in equal measure. He noticed everything. The way she redirected conversations away from her domestic arrangements. The blue wool dress, worn always with different collars to vary its appearance. The way she never once asked about the Fairbridge income, or his prospects, or what manner of settlement he might offer a wife. She asked him once what was in the library. He spent an hour and a half answering. She listened to every word and asked a question at the end that demonstrated she had retained all of it. She told him in turn that she had a talent for figures, that she had managed her father's accounts for 2 years before his death, and had caught 3 separate errors in his solicitor's quarterly reports. She said it without pride, as a plain statement of practical fact, the way one might mention an aptitude for languages. James listened and understood that he was being shown something. Not performed at, but genuinely shown. the difference being that one required an audience and the other required only honesty. He was falling in love with her. He knew it with the same cold clarity he brought to everything he was most reluctant to admit. And then, on a Tuesday evening in the third week of May, he heard something that threatened to unravel everything he had carefully and quietly begun to build. He had arrived at Henrietta Street unannounced. The front door was answered by the household's only remaining footman, who showed James to the corridor outside the drawing room and went to find Rosalind. The study door at the far end of the hall stood slightly ajar. James did not intend to listen. But old London townhouses were built with the particular acoustic cruelty of structures designed by people who had never needed to keep a difficult secret, and the voices carried with perfect clarity. The man speaking was unfamiliar, the voice of someone thoroughly accustomed to being agreed with. "Lord Harwick has increased his offer, and his patience is not without limit, Rosalind. You are not in a position to indulge romantic preferences." And Rosalind's voice, lower, carrying that quality of restraint, James now recognized as the sound of someone holding something very large, very still. "I have not refused him because of romantic preferences, uncle. I have refused him because his reputation regarding his first wife is not something I am willing to dismiss."
Reputation.
Her uncle delivered the word with the contemptuous brevity of a man who found it an inconvenience. "You are cultivating the Earl of Fairbridge. When that arrangement produces an offer, you may make your choice. Until it does, you will not close the Harwick door." "I am not cultivating anyone. Rosalind." "I am not cultivating anyone," she said again, with a quiet and absolute finality that filled the hallway like cold water. The footman reappeared at the corridor's end, having failed to locate Rosalind, and found James standing very still by the wall instead. James placed his hat on the hall stand with great composure, said he had remembered a prior engagement, and left. He did not return to Henrietta Street. He told himself the evidence was plain. The test had finally worked as designed. Rosalind Cavendish was a woman in desperate financial circumstances conducting a deliberate campaign to secure him while keeping a secondary arrangement carefully in reserve. The warmth, the honesty, the blue dress worn 3 different ways, all of it reshaded now into something calculated and precise. He told himself this with great thoroughness. He found to his considerable irritation that he did not entirely believe it, but he had believed Charlotte Hale. He had followed the evidence of her affection right up until the morning it had meant nothing, and the scar that left behind was not the kind a man examined twice if he possessed any instinct for self-preservation. He withdrew. He went to Fairbridge Hall. He had the library reorganized. Rosalind noticed his absence on the 3rd day. She told herself it was not significant. Men of his rank shifted their attentions according to priorities invisible to the people around them. She told herself this was the natural geometry of London society, and she had been foolish to mistake sustained interest for something more durable. She told herself all of this in the blue wool dress, at the window of the bare drawing room, with the particular internal discipline of a woman who had spent 7 months learning that grief does not wait for a convenient moment, and must therefore be managed like any other logistical problem. She did not cry. She had spent 7 months teaching herself that tears were a luxury she could not budget for. What she did instead, on the 4th day, was send a brief and courteous note to Lord Harwick's household, acknowledging his renewed offer and requesting a week's additional consideration. It bought her time. It was not acceptance, and she was entirely clear in her own mind on that distinction. But time was the only currency she had left, and she intended to spend it carefully. Then she sat in the faded drawing room and looked at the bare side tables and thought about a man who had kept his library for reasons she understood better than he knew. Edward Rowe arrived at Fairbridge Hall on a Thursday with muddy boots, wine he had not been invited to bring, and the expression of a man who had spent the entire 4-hour journey composing his argument. "You are wrong," Edward said, setting the bottle on James's study floor without ceremony. "Good afternoon, Edward. You are categorically, specifically, and rather magnificently wrong, and I have ridden 4 hours to say so in person, because a letter would not adequately convey the breadth of your error." He dropped into the nearest chair. "I have been making inquiries I did not ask you to. No, you never do. That is why I do it." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Lord Harwick has made 3 separate offers to the Cavendish household since February, before you ever entered the picture. Rosalind has refused every single one. Her uncle has been applying pressure since March. She has not accepted. She went to Harwick's drawing room precisely once, and she looked, according to 2 reliable accounts, like a woman attending her own sentencing." James said nothing. "Furthermore," Edward continued with the relentless energy of a man not yet finished, "she has refused Harwick specifically because of his conduct toward his late wife. A woman who endured 7 wretched years before dying of a chest complaint at 31. Rosalind has known this since January. She has been refusing a man who could resolve every material difficulty in her life, because she will not pay that particular price." He leaned forward. "That is not the behavior of a woman cultivating you toward a settlement, James. That is the behavior of a woman with principles she cannot afford and refuses to surrender." James was quiet for a long time. "There is one more thing," Edward said. His voice changed, less argument, more something older and more careful. "I spoke to my aunt, Lady Rowe, who was acquainted with Rosalind's mother. She asked me something when I mentioned the Cavendish name." He watched James steadily. "Do you remember the summer you were 15? When your father had that ruinous business with the Devereux investment? The one that nearly cost the North Wing?" James looked up slowly. "Your mother hosted a house party that August, as she always did, as though nothing were wrong. Several families attended. Lord Danforth brought his wife and his daughter." Edward held his gaze. "You would have been in the library." The room went entirely still. James could see it now with the sudden devastating clarity of a man who has been staring at a familiar word so long he stopped reading it. A summer library. Late afternoon light through tall windows. Himself at 15, sitting in the corner, with a book he was not reading, carrying the full and shameful weight of his family's possible collapse. And a girl 12 years old, gray-eyed, with a seriousness that seemed to belong to someone twice her age, who had found him there and offered neither hollow comfort nor polite retreat. She had simply sat in the chair across from him and said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who had not yet learned to dress difficult truths in softer clothing, "I hope your father kept the library. Everything else can be rebuilt." He had been 15 and too proud to thank her and too desperate to send her away. He had never forgotten those words, not once in 16 years. He had simply, catastrophically, failed to attach them to a face. She had remembered him. She had walked into that blazing ballroom, heard his false confession, and recognized him, not as the Earl of Fairbridge with his title and his elaborate test, but as the boy in the library, and she had answered him the only way she knew how, with the same words, the same quiet offering, not as strategy, not as calculation, because that was simply fundamentally who she was. James was already reaching for his coat before Edward finished speaking. He arrived at Henrietta Street as the light was failing. Rosalind answered the door herself, the footman apparently engaged elsewhere, and looked at him without surprise and without performance, with the gray-eyed attention he had spent weeks learning and days trying to dismantle and completely failed to. "My lord," she said. "I heard your conversation with your uncle," James said, 2 weeks ago, in the hallway." Something moved across her face, not shame. Something quieter and more complicated. The expression of a woman calculating how much damage had been done, and from which direction. "Then you heard something that was not the full truth of the matter, delivered by someone with a strong interest in a particular interpretation." "I heard enough to make a decision I should not have made." "You heard me described as cultivating you," Rosalind said. She stepped back from the door, as close as she came to an invitation. "Come in, then." The drawing room was colder than it had been, the fire considerably smaller. He sat across from her and did not pretend not to notice, and she did not pretend the fire was adequate, and the honesty of that small shared acknowledgement cost them nothing and meant a great deal. "I was not cultivating you," Rosalind said. She held his gaze without effort, something he had long since catalogued as a thing she did because she found it more honest, not because she was performing composure. "I knew from the first evening that you were not ruined. I knew you had a reason for the fiction, and I did not object to it, because a man conducting that particular test had been hurt badly enough to justify the architecture." She did not look away. "I liked you. I liked the wound behind the test, even if the test itself was a somewhat unkind thing to do to strangers. And I was not in a position, financially or otherwise, to pretend I was not in need of something better than my current circumstances. But I was not willing to secure that something through manipulation. So I was simply honest. As honest as I knew how to be." "You knew me," James said, "before the ball," the faintest shift in her expression. "Something older than surprise. I wondered if you would remember." "I didn't," he said plainly. "Not until this week. I have spent 16 years carrying those words, and I had completely severed them from the girl who said them." He held her gaze. "I am sorry for that." Rosalind was quiet for a moment. Outside, the street was settling into its evening sounds. Carriage wheels on cobblestones, the ordinary machinery of a city continuing without interest in either of them. "You were 15 and ashamed," she said at last, "and those are the years from which we retain the least. I was 12, and I thought you were the saddest person I had ever seen in a room full of books, and I gave you the only thing I had, which was an honest opinion." The corner of her mouth moved. "I did not expect it to follow me into a ballroom 16 years later." "It followed me considerably further than that," James said. She looked at the small fire. He looked at her. "I withdrew," he said, "because I was frightened. Not of you. Of being wrong again in the same direction. Of having constructed something from evidence I had selected, because I wanted it to be true, the way I had done once before." He let the admission sit without decorating it. "That was my failure, not yours. And you have been managing the consequences of my cowardice, while I was at Fairbridge reorganizing a library I should have been standing in this room to protect." Rosalind looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read, which was unusual, because he had catalogued most of them by now. This one was the particular look of a woman deciding how far to lower a wall she had spent considerable time and effort building to specification. "My uncle expects an answer for Harwick before the week is out," she said quietly. "I have asked for a brief extension. It will not hold." "Then I will not require it to," James said. He leaned forward slightly. "Rosalind, I have spent 3 seasons testing for the wrong thing entirely. I was asking whether a woman could withstand a fabricated disaster, when the only question worth asking was whether I could withstand a real one." He did not look away. "I am asking now, not as a test, not with a fiction between us. As a man who has been carrying a 12-year-old girl's advice about libraries in his chest for 16 years, and has only just understood where it came from, and who would very much like the opportunity to deserve it." The fire shifted quietly in the grate. Rosalind looked at the floor for one brief, unguarded moment. When she raised her eyes, the most expensive smile she owned was entirely absent, and what replaced it was something undefended and real, and far more valuable than anything she had sold to keep the house standing. "I should tell you," she said carefully, "that I come with debts sufficient to embarrass a less organized man. A townhouse that is essentially a beautifully maintained argument against itself, and an uncle who has developed the habit of treating my future as a ledger entry." James held her gaze. "I kept the library," he said. "Everything else can be rebuilt." Rosalind Cavendish laughed, not the contained social sound of a woman in a ballroom, but an actual unguarded laugh, quiet and warm and entirely her own. And James Wentworth, 8th Earl of Fairbridge, understood that he had spent 16 years and 3 London seasons and 1 elaborate unkind test, arriving at a faded drawing-room on Henrietta Street on a Wednesday evening in May, and that all of it had been, in its own circuitous and occasionally humiliating way. Exactly right. He did not propose that evening. She would not have accepted that evening, and he understood this just because she was a woman who required the substance of a thing rather than its performance. So he came back the following morning with a formal offer, made directly to Rosalind, not to her uncle, on the straightforward grounds that she was the one who would be accepting it, and she was the one who deserved to read the accurate document first. It came with full disclosure of his circumstances, and the estate accounts going back 7 years, because she had a talent for figures, and he was no longer in the business of withholding information from people who had earned it. Her uncle, when subsequently informed that the Earl of Fairbridge had made a formal offer, and that Rosalind had that same hour written a polite and permanent refusal to Lord Harwick, found that his objections were considerably less pressing than he had previously imagined. There was something about an earl's title and a solvent estate that produced a clarifying effect on a man who had been treating his niece as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be consulted. He withdrew his opposition with the smooth efficiency of someone already planning to claim credit for the outcome at a later date. Rosalind reviewed James's offer with the focused attention of a woman who had been managing household accounts since the age of 19. She found one clause she wished amended. He had it corrected the following morning without argument or explanation, because she was right and he knew it, and there was nothing further to say. She accepted on the Thursday. They were married in September at the church in the village near Fairbridge Hall, with the late summer light coming through old, leaded glass and the library visible from the churchyard through the east windows. Rosalind had chosen the September date with those east windows specifically in mind. James pretended not to know this. Neither of them mentioned it, which had become their particular language. The quiet, private fluency of two people who had stopped performing for each other and started simply speaking. On the morning after the wedding, he found her in the library before breakfast. She was in the chair by the east window, one of his agricultural treatises open in her lap, a cup of tea cooling on the side table, her hair unpinned, still in her dressing gown, entirely at home in a room she had decided required no formal permission to inhabit. She looked up without embarrassment. "The drainage records for the North Estate are 3 years out of date," she said, with the composed certainty of a woman who had already decided what to do about it. "And there is a discrepancy in the tenant payments from last autumn that your steward has apparently chosen not to notice." James leaned against the doorframe and looked at his wife in the early morning light, with the expression of a man who has finally, at considerable personal cost, stopped conducting tests and learned simply to pay attention. "I kept the library," he said. Rosalind marked her page. "You did," she agreed, turning back to the accounts with the quiet satisfaction of a woman entirely, and at last in her element. "I was fairly certain you would. If this story stayed with you, the girl who gave a sad boy the only thing she had, and the man who spent 16 years carrying it without knowing why, share it with someone who believes the best love is never about fortune or performance, but about being seen accurately and choosing to stay. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. The next story is already waiting, and it begins, as the best ones always do, with something nobody had the courage to say out loud.